it's in the very extreme form, it creates the kind of terrorists that attacked French citizens since the cartoons of Charlie Hebdo.
He gets very upset that I'm using the word Islam to describe a terrorist.
I'm a Muslim myself, so I'm proud of my faith, but not everything I see currently in the Muslim world, for sure.
What is it we think about when we talk about political Islam or Islamism? Is it something we should worry about? Hi, my name is Phil Gurski. You're listening to Canadian Intelligence, a podcast about public safety and national security. In the wake of a series of attacks in France, including a horrific beheading of a teacher who had sought to talk about a very controversial issue, the so-called Muhammad cartoons from the mid-2000s, a great debate has erupted, not only in France, but around the world, with respect to what's going on in terms of terrorism and what's driving it. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, came out with a very controversial statement saying that Islam has a problem, and he talked about political Islamism. Not surprisingly, the head of the far right in France, Marine Le Pen, said that France must declare war on the ideology of Islamism, saying it should be considered an enemy of France. In response, a lot of nations, Muslim nations, Middle Eastern nations, called for boycotts against French goods, saying that France was in fact attacking Islam. I've been thinking a lot about this issue and came across a fascinating piece in Foreign Policy, which is an online news site written by the gentleman who will join me in a few minutes, about this whole issue of political Islam, Islamism, what terminology we use, what does it all mean. So I'm very delighted to invite on my podcast Mustafa Akyol, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. He's a Turkish journalist and author. He's worked in journalism for more than a decade, and he's also been an opinion writer for the New York Times. So Mustafa, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Phil. It's an important topic, and I'm glad we have a chance to discuss it here.
The foreign policy article that I cited, Mustafa, which came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago, was entitled, "Yes, Islam is facing a crisis. No, France isn't helping to solve it." What did you mean by that?
What I meant was this. This all began, this recent controversy began when Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said in early October in a speech about extremism, he said Islam is a religion that is in crisis all over the world. And then France had two horrific terrorist attacks, which was, the problem he had in mind. And a lot of Muslims reacted to the notion that Islam is in crisis. I'm a Muslim myself, so I'm proud of my faith, but not everything I see currently in the Muslim world, for sure. I said I wanted to write an article saying, yeah, let's be honest. There is a crisis of our religion. Our religion is facing a crisis. And it's not just Macron, but many other Muslims have said that. Iraqi statesman Ali Allawi wrote a book, The Crisis of the Islamic Civilization. Similar terms have been used. We're in difficult times. We are facing turmoil. Of course, the nature of this crisis will be interpreted quite differently for the people that you rightly called Islamists. The crisis is because Muslims have given up too much of their tradition and bought into Western ideas. So that is the crisis. Whereas others would say the crisis is because there are interpretations. My understanding of the so-called crisis is that there are interpretations of Islam today in the world that generate violence or authoritarianism or oppression in the name of Islam. And that happens through blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, that happens through patriarchy and all of those things. And this is creating a big controversy in the world. So that is the crisis. And it's not a surprise that religions go through a crisis. In the 17th century, Christianity was certainly in crisis when Christians and Protestants were slaughtering each other. It was much more violent, actually, compared to the scene in the Muslim world today. But you go out of the crisis by accepting certain values of live and let live and toleration and non-coercion, as I often emphasize. That has happened in Christianity by and large. It has not fully, at least, happened in Islam. And I said that is the crisis, and we should talk about this.
The one term, Mustafa, that gets used a lot and it really bothers some people is the term Islamism. I've been in a debate with somebody on LinkedIn now for, oh God, months, where when I use the term Islamist extremism, which I think is a solidly accepted term, not only amongst academics, but amongst terrorism practitioners, he gets very upset that I'm using the word Islam to describe a terrorist movement. What is it about Islamism that you think is so controversial? Do you see it as a legitimate term yourself?
I do see it as a legitimate term, and I see it as an indeed helpful term to distinguish from Islam, the religion. And it is a heavily politicized interpretation of Islam, which takes certain issues from the Islamic tradition, certain themes, and makes it into a political program. And the point is, not every Muslim agrees with this. The majority of the Muslims do not agree with this, but Islamists are the ones who create this political ideology. Uh, that ideology is authoritarian because it wants to fundamentally capture the state, it wants to capture political power in the name of Islam. And of course, it is always a certain group acting in the name of Islam, so which will give themselves the power and transform the society to ban sin or heresy or apostasy, however they seen it. So it is an ideology of religious authoritarianism, and uh, it doesn't mean all Islamists are violent. Most of them are not. It doesn't mean in democracies Islamists or Islamism should be criminalized. I don't think it should be. I don't think it should be criminalized. Just like communism. I mean, I think in the during the Cold War, I mean, there were communists, some of which were violent. There were groups like Red Brigades. They were doing some terrorist attacks even in Europe. But most communists wanted to come to power through even democracy. So it's not illegal, but it is a problematic authoritarian ideology. And if you go further on the spectrum, you get into very violent versions of the ideology, and the same thing in Islam. I mean, ISIS is the Khmer Rouge of Islamism. I've been always saying that.
Mm-hmm.
It is too
Mm-hmm.
extreme. Even other, Islamists will find it too violent and unacceptable. But it is coming out of this ideology that you should capture a state and impose what you think as true Islam on others. And again, it should be distinguished from Islam because the overwhelming majority, I mean, I should say more than 90% of probably all Muslims around the world don't buy into this.
Mm. I recall a differentiation made years ago when it came to Islamism. Some person, I forget who it was, talked about quietists, those that were simply very faithful, very believing people in terms of Muslims. The political, which would be your political Islamists, and of course your violent extremists, which are your Al Qaeda's and your ISIS's of the world. I liked your analogy about ISIS being the Khmer Rouge. That's really interesting. You talked a little bit just recently, Mustafa, about how all religions go through crises, and that's absolutely true. You talked about how Catholics and Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries. I once heard an analogy made, and I'm curious what you think about this. I'm not sure I buy it, but here it is. Someone once said that if you look at Islam and the development of Islam as a faith, so if we agree that Islam really saw the light of day in the very early 7th century of the Common Era, Islam, and according to the Islamic calendar, which of course is lunar in nature, you're in year 1420 or 1425, whatever that is. If we go back to Christianity as an analogous faith, where was Christianity 1400 years after its beginning? Well, we were in the religious wars of the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. I mean, I know that one religion can't follow another in terms of its development, but is that a fair comparison to make that says that maybe Islam simply has to evolve more as a faith to get out of this sectarian and internecine violence that we saw in Christianity in the 14th century?
It is a somewhat helpful analogy, but as you said, there are important differences. I mean, first of all, I mean, I don't see it as a timeline. Like in 14th century, you magically come at a point. It's of course not like that. What has made the big change in Christianity, if you ask me, is the era we call the Enlightenment. even before that, you can say some steps were taken to avert sectarian violence, like Westphalia. But I think with the ideas of thinkers like John Locke, the notion that Christianity should not be imposed and it should be left to the conscience of individuals and willingly, organized communities, voluntary communities, became gradually accepted. It took a while. I mean, not all Protestants accept this. Catholicism, discussed whether secular state is acceptable or not until the 20th century. But Christians ultimately came to the position that yes, we don't burn people at the stake anymore, or we don't, compel people to enter the church, which was an idea, extracted from a certain line in the New Testament back then. Uh, so that giving up coercive power, that's how I define it, has happened in Christianity. Islam, actually, if you ask me, is a religion more similar to Judaism than Christianity, because of its legalistic religion and theology wise, it's much more similar to Judaism. But it is the same thing. Do you use coercive power? Which means, do you have religion police forcing people to, not drink alcohol and flog them if they do? Do you go after people for apostasy, which is them, giving up Islam, changing their religion publicly? Do you punish blasphemers? These are the big issues. And Islam as a religious tradition has what we call fiqh, or jurisprudence, which is the
Hmm.
interpretation of the Sharia, which has some harsh verdicts on these issues. And the Islamists are the people who embellish these verdicts, who make them into a political program, and who want to implement them passionately. So they're not coming out of nowhere. So they're coming out of this tradition, but making this as the main motivation. So we Muslims have to face these issues. We do. I mean, we have a lot of scholars called the reformists or the modernists who are criticizing these. There are different ways of getting over this, right? I mean, some people say, yes, there are some of those verdicts, but it's not the right time to implement them. I believe we need to go into a bigger questioning and saying that, yes, there are these verdicts about coercing, about imposition, about violently punishing heresy, blasphemy, whatever is sinful. But we have to get over with this. Otherwise, this will generate either uh, extremist groups, like we see in Pakistan, for example, very often. People go out on the streets chanting to kill the blasphemers, and sometimes they do. And it can create oppressive states from Saudi Arabia to Iran, which impose a dress code on women, for example. Or it's in the very extreme form, it creates the kind of terrorists that attacked French citizens since the cartoons of Charlie Hebdo. Uh, Again, this is a spectrum, but there are fundamental issues that needs to be resolved, and that's why we Muslims honestly should think about these.
If I can ask you, Mustafa, as somebody who's looked at Islam over the centuries, my understanding, and I'm not an Islamic historian, I know a little bit about it, that you go back 1,000 years or so, and Islam was actually a very different faith back then. It was very progressive in many ways. Some of the greatest scientific discoveries at the time were all carried out by Muslim scholars. They fundamentally changed our way of looking at the world at a time when Christianity was in its so-called dark ages. If it's possible to ask you this question, I'm not seeking for a definitive moment, but where did the wheels where did the wheels go off the bus in terms of the transformation of a fairly open faith for the time, at least in comparison to other faiths, to where we have, like you said, people in the streets of Pakistan calling for the death of blasphemers, and the Saudis enforcing conservative dress on people. Bernard Lewis, I think, wrote a book many years ago, but what went wrong. Do you have an answer to that?
Indeed, actually, that is one of the questions I tackle and try to answer in my forthcoming book, Reopening Muslim Minds: A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. I use the concept return in the subtitle because I'm calling on Muslims to look back and discover some of the lost sources of wisdom, let's say, in our religious tradition. And thank you for reminding that. I mean, that is also why we are speaking of Islam being in crisis today, If you went back to 500 years ago, you would not be speaking of any crisis of Islam. You would be speaking about the crisis of Christianity. Or if you compare them, you would find the Islamic world more tolerant. As you said, it was creative, it was more open. I mean, scientific discoveries were coming out of the Muslim world mainly 1,000 years ago. And even in the 1600s, 1700s still, the Muslim world was more tolerant. And this was pointed out by some Europeans. John Bowden, French intellectual, he said, look at the Ottoman Empire. They can worship there. Everybody can worship according to their conscience. Indeed, before modernity, Islamic world was comparatively, generally more tolerant. That's why Jews had a better experience under Islam than medieval Christianity, pre-modern Christianity. Jews fled to the Ottoman Empire from Spain in the 15th century because they were persecuted by the Spanish Inquisition, where the Ottomans wouldn't bother with their religion, and they established a very golden age for their very troubled history in the Ottoman lands. This changed in two different directions. One, modern West, with the Enlightenment, with liberalism, with human rights, with liberal democracy, took a very big step forward by establishing equal rights for everybody and non-coercion and toleration and individual freedom and so on and so forth. First of all, compared to that, the standards of the pre-modern Islamic civilization looked a little bit regressive. I mean, one example, we mentioned the tolerance of medieval Islam. In medieval Islam, Christians and Jews were not forced to convert into Islam. They were still equal. They were not equal citizens, though. They were tolerated as second-class citizens. That was a great thing for its time. I mean, you being not killed for your religion, that was an amazing thing. But if you establish in the world the idea of equal citizenship regardless of your creed, and if you still have an Islamic jurisprudence which establishes Muslims should be supreme and others can be tolerated with lesser rights, that doesn't look good anymore. So on the one hand, the West and the modern world, let's say, and it began with the West, but the modern liberalism and human rights, it took a very big step forward. Compared to that, the standards of Islamic jurisprudence began to look regressive. On top of that, the Muslim world even lost some of the existing tolerance and diversity because it became more reactionary, it became more angry. Again, the situation of Jews in the Muslim world is a great example. I mean, until the 20th century, you would say Jews have felt better and lived more peacefully and happily in Islam. But quite the contrary in the 20th century, with the reaction to Israel, Arab-Israeli wars, with the general feeling of besiegement, Islam lost its tolerance to Jews. And actually, we've seen the destruction of Jewish communities all across the Arab world. And there's an ugly Semitism out there. So civilizations change. Again, comparing the Islamic medium of today with the Western medium today gives you a different picture. But if you go back, yes, there was a time. And I am also convinced that the medieval early Islamic enlightenment, or let's say civilizational success in terms of creativity, openness, tolerance, that was allowed by certain theological beliefs about universalism, about learning from other civilizations, including ancient Greeks. But those theological beliefs were pushed aside in favor of more exclusivist thinking. And that's why my next book is titled Reopening Muslim Minds, calling for Muslims to regain some perspectives that which once made us more open, tolerant, and creative.
I'm so glad you talked about the history. I think a lot of people either simply don't know a lot about Islamic history or seek to marginalize it, but there truly was an incredible era of openness, as you said, which unfortunately, for a variety of reasons that are far too complicated to get into a podcast, has changed. Bringing it back to the present, Mustafa, and bringing it back to the situation in France, There certainly have been some very unhelpful remarks made. I mean, Marine Le Pen, she says what you expect her to say. There's no surprise that she would say that Islamism is the number one threat to France's national security. But what about the role that things like Islamophobia, uh, outright racism, and the fact that France did have a colonial past in many parts of the Muslim world? How is this complicating the conversation right now in terms of when Muslims hear France, the French president saying Islam's in crisis, and they point to, well, you guys are part of the problem, in part because of your history. How does this play into the whole affair?
Thank you so much for bringing that up because, I have a lot of criticisms to the state of affairs in the Muslim world today, but I have a lot of criticism to the state of affairs in the Western world and some of the harsh, intolerant approaches to Islam. And France is actually one of the key examples there. First of all, one thing, I think to say Islamism is a threat is wrong. Jihadism is a threat because most Islamists are not violent. I mean, their ideology might be troubling, but they're not violent. The violent Islamists, and even among the Islamists, they're a minority, are generally called jihadis or jihadists. Yeah, those people are a threat because they can blow up a bomb and kill people. But Islamism is an ideology. That ideology cannot be criminalized. Here, I want to remind Westerners a few episodes in their history. During the Cold War, communism was a threat, right? It was an ideological threat. But McCarthyism was not a right response. To start a witch hunt in your own country to curb your own civil liberties because you think the Reds are everywhere, and maybe some people were Reds, but you even exaggerate that and you start to see everybody who's a little bit left leaning as a Stalinist. That was a very, very big mistake in American history, for example. And that's why in all these discussions about Islam, I would grant that there is a threat from jihadists, and Islamism is an authoritarian ideology that we should be thinking about without necessarily criminalizing it. But there's a McCarthyistic strain in the West today, represented by the far right in France, as you mentioned, Marine Le Pen, and in the U.S. some circles as well. And I think that's very wrong for both democracy within those societies, and also it's a wrong medicine. It's an authoritarian response which will make things worse. What also, there's another thing with France. In my article, I said, yes, Islam is in a crisis, but we need an enlightenment. That's true. I agree with that. I'm writing about an enlightenment within Islam. But it has to be authentic. It's coming from its own roots and sources. That's my next book is about. Moreover, if you present enlightenment as an anti-religious idea, good luck with that. That's not going to be helpful to our problem here. And the problem in France, I mean, historically speaking, is that its notion of enlightenment has a strong dose of combat with religion. Whereas I think in the British and American traditions, you see more harmony with faith and reason, harmony between faith and reason. So it's kind of evolution of religious thinking towards a more tolerant position. Whereas in France, it was about curbing the power of the Catholic Church, sometimes with violence or dictates and authoritarianism. That's why French laïcité, secularism, it has a very high bar. I mean, through French laïcité, headscarves were banned in French public schools, in official jobs. You wouldn't think of the same thing in the UK or US, or let's say Canada outside of Quebec, if I'm not wrong. Uh, and what I think is that that's kind of strident secularism is precisely the wrong solution to the problem here. Because if you want to save a lot more Muslims from believing into Islamism, from seeing themselves as the alien, and from fully integrating into Western society, you should make them feel proud of their faith. It is not a problem when a pious Muslim woman wears a headscarf and becomes a part of society, even at the age of 15, or or as a police person, woman, or getting a public job or getting a public position. And I think by its very high bar of secularism, France is rather unhelping its own cause, the cause of making Muslims in France feeling fully French and embracing the values of that country.
I don't find it a coincidence that the province of Quebec is the only one here that has enacted legislation very similar to that in France. Of course, in many ways, Quebec still looks to France as sort of their spiritual leader, if I can use that term. You've talked about this need for an honest conversation within the Muslim world, and you and I both know, Mustafa, the Muslim world doesn't really exist. There are Muslim worlds. Each country has their own particular way of looking at things. Even within countries, you have splits and divisions. Where do you think, in an ideal situation, if you were to, have the hand of Allah or the hand of God and be able to say, this is the way we're going to go forward, what would be the perfect way out of this atmosphere of intolerance, this atmosphere of hate in some cases that unfortunately pervades far too many parts of the Islamic world? What's the best exit strategy from your perspective?
Sure. First, thanks for reminding. I mean, the incredible diversity of the Muslim world, quote unquote. Actually, I recently published a report for the Cato Institute, Freedom in the Muslim World. And there I show by data from the Human Freedom Index that also Cato publishes every year, that, some Muslim majority countries are actually quite free and they don't have any of the problems we're talking about. Which are those? Well, Bosnia and Herzegovina or Albania, like Eastern European, Southeastern European countries, their freedom levels. I mean, we measure freedom in these countries through data, are like Greece or Argentina. But if you come to the Middle East, most of the Arab society countries, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, that's a whole different thing. So Muslim world is quite diverse, and the problems we're talking about is about certain countries and areas in the Muslim world, not for the whole scene there. It's good to remind that. Now, how will we go forward? I mean, uh, here is what I'm sensing. The lowest point in the history of a religion might be precisely the point from where you begin to go forward with new ideas. I mean, it was not an accident that enlightenment came after the horrific experience of violence in the name of Christianity in Europe, the 30 Years' War, before that, the Sant Bartolomeo massacres. The Protestant Catholic fighting ultimately made many Christians fed up with this. And some people came up with the idea, why don't we tolerate each other? Why don't we question the teachings that don't allow us to tolerate each other? So, because people, I mean, societies change through experience. I mean, intellectuals can make up some good ideas out there, but whether they become fashionable, whether they become popular, depends on the experience people go through. And my sense is that maybe we are at a point like that in Islam. I mean, in the past couple of decades, the Muslim world has seen more violence, coercion, scandalous acts in the name of Islam. I mean, ISIS was the most horrific case, but Taliban, civil wars, authoritarianism of regimes like Iran or Saudi Arabia. 100 years ago, Christianity wasn't necessarily too liberal compared to that. I mean, at least 300 years ago. But the world has come to a very different point, and there are these very harsh, rigid interpretations of Islam. That is also shocking many Muslims themselves. I mean, we should not forget that when Pakistani Islamists march in the streets chanting, kill the kafirs and the blasphemers, uh, those people are there, but also many Pakistanis are saying, how do we get out of this? And that feeling, how do we get out of this, is the very basis, I think, on which new interpretations of Islam are already developing, but further will develop. The complication, of course, here is that we don't have a pope who can, just declare a human dignity like a declaration and change things overnight, because it's like Protestantism, it's very diverse and decentralized. So the battle of ideas, if you will, are going on. And humbly, with my work, I'm trying to add something into those ideas. There are many valuable scholars who have been thinking about these issues, who've been calling for change. And I think their ideas will be more influential thanks to precisely the horrific consequences of the bad ideas, which Muslims are seeing every day, like the Westerners, they are seeing it. One thing that has stopped Muslims from seeing this is some Muslims, let's say, seeing this is belief in conspiracy theories, belief in totally Western propaganda and everything is a lie and so on and so forth. But I think there's an end to that. There's a limit to that.
You make so many good points, Mustafa, and I'm very grateful for you for walking us through this. But at the same time, do you ever fear for your own safety? I mean, a lot of what you're saying makes sense to me as a Western secular citizen, a Canadian citizen. But I imagine that what you're calling for would actually anger a lot of people who think that this is the true way forward for Islam. To kill the blasphemers and to be at perpetual war with those that deny Islam. Are you worried about your own safety at any point?
My wife should not hear that question. And I mean, I'm okay right now. I mean, I'm in a safe environment and writing about these ideas, and I think I'm not the the person that those people are will find as the most problematic. I mean, they probably go after people who really are against Islam, whereas I'm a Muslim myself. I'm proud of my faith. I'm just trying to revive some lost traditions. But to come to back to your question, I mean, I have been in trouble a few times. I mean, one important episode was I was arrested in Malaysia in 2017 by the religion police after giving a conference, public conference in Kuala Lumpur on religious freedom. The issue was apostasy, and in the conference, I said people should not be punished for apostasy. We don't want Muslims to leave the faith, but if they do, it's their conscience, and we should respect their decision. I said you cannot police a religion. And at the end of the conference, five serious guys walked in. They said, "We are the religion police you've been talking about." And I had a bad night with them, a stressful night. They took me to a court the next day. Thanks to some diplomacy, high level diplomacy, I was let go. And Malaysia is, of course, milder compared to countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia on these things. So, but that showed me that not everybody will be happy with these ideas, and those people who are not happy will not just make an argument against you, but they might find some other means to make sure you're not very vocal. My book was banned in Malaysia after that. My early book, Islam Without Extremes, was banned for 3 years. So yes, there are environments in which these ideas will be met with some intolerance, and either that's through some police action or, God forbid, more even violent acts. So I mean, that's something I know. The world is out there, but I'm trying to say still what I say.
Well, I congratulate you. You are taking a stand. I think it's a very important stand, and I really appreciate sort of the nuances that you've brought out in this conversation here, Mustafa. We could probably talk about this for hours, but in an era you talked about conspiracy theories and fake news, we're living in a world where people don't like nuance. They like black and white. They like to be told this is right, this is wrong, or as Bernard Lewis famously expressed it, "I'm right, you're wrong, go to hell." And I think you've brought a very important, made a very important contribution to this debate on political Islam, Islamism, Islam relations with the West, what Islam has to do for itself. But before I let you go, so you talked about your most recent book. What are the details on that?
Definitely. That's something I want to talk about for sure. Just even before that, let me just remind one more thing, if you have 1 minute. Uh,
Sure.
Liberalism is also not guaranteed in the West. I mean, we are very clearly seeing that. I mean, you mentioned conspiracy theories, which is, I think, a big part of the problem in the Muslim world. Muslims can't look into their issues very honestly because of conspiracy theories. Whoa, the conspiracy theories have become big in the United States. I mean, a lot of people believe, in some crazy cabals running the country, and so I don't want to get into detail, but the liberal values that I cherish and want to advance within the Islamic framework are also being these days challenged in the West. So the battle, if you will, this if it's a good battle, which I believe it is, should be given everywhere. By the way, and no guarantees. No
Absolutely.
society is immune to these problems of bigotry or paranoia and hatred and all that. And regarding my book, I mean, I have a forthcoming book to be published by St. Martin's Press, Reopening Muslim Minds: A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Toleration. In the book, I get into, first of all these hot button issues. I have a chapter on apostasy laws. I get into Islamic jurisprudence and where are these exactly coming from? What hadiths, what did they really mean? Were they really authentic? The blasphemy laws, and so on and so forth. I also try to infer some perspectives from medieval thinkers like Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, Ibn Tufayl, his teacher, who wrote a fascinating novel, Hay Ibn Yaksan, which many people don't know today, but which had a profound influence on Enlightenment thinkers back in the 17th century when it was translated from Arabic to Latin and then English and German and other languages in the West. What I'm trying to get at is, well, the Enlightenment, and again, the Enlightenment is a complex phenomenon. There is an aspect of it that, that is connected to colonialism, and there were some racist ideas there as well among some people. But generally, the idea of toleration, pluralism, freedom, individual freedom, non coercion in religious matters, these ideas just didn't come out of the West because West has something unmatched and so on and so forth. I tried to show in the book that they had some Islamic roots. One example, we value free speech. Free speech. I do value a lot. It's a very important value. Where does it come from? Well, different people have written about that, of course, especially in the Western tradition, John Stuart Mill and people before that. Uh, According to Rabbi Sachs, which we lost actually recently, may he rest in peace, the idea could be traced back to Ibn Rushd, the Muslim philosopher from Spain, because when he was criticizing his opponents, intellectual opponents, he was always quoting them in full, and he has a line which he says, when you are refuting an idea, always give it a fair share and quote it, otherwise you will be admitting your own weakness. He thinks that this has started a literary approach reflected among some Jewish writings in the medieval era, which ultimately evolved into the culture that we call today free speech. So freedom of speech, when French champions that and Muslims when hear that word, Muslims can say, oh, well, we had a role in this. One of our thinkers, Ibn Rushd, with his writings and with his statements, actually exemplified and and anticipated the notion of free speech. So it's not alien. So, and of course, Westerners can understand that these ideas just didn't come up in the West, but also there were a lot of borrowings from different civilizations. So we're not living in a very clear-cut world. So my book just is an intellectual story that is going through themes like that are mostly forgotten or little noticed, and try to present what I call the case for an Islamic enlightenment.
I'm looking forward to reading the book when it comes out, Mustafa. I want to thank you for taking the time. I find that we are in a world where there's a lot of shouting going on, and that some of the quieter voices in the middle are being ignored or are being basically drowned out in a lot of the noise. Your voice is an important one. You have given us an interesting look at what is a very complicated issue, and as in most cases is being reduced to something simplistic. It's actually more complicated than that. I wish you well with the book, and thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you, Phil. It's been a pleasure. Hope to discuss on the book maybe when it comes out. Thank you.
I'll certainly invite you back when that comes out. So that was my conversation with Mustafa Akyol about, some pretty emotional events right now. Terrorist attacks in France, etc., etc. What do you think about this notion of a political Islam and that Islam has to take a look at it inside to see what's going on? I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BorealisSaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and Facebook. If you like the content, want to subscribe to more, go to the website, borealisthreatrisk.com, hit the subscribe button, and you get a free daily digest of all the blogs and podcasts each morning to your inbox. I'd love to hear from you. I'll talk again soon. Until then, stay safe.